It's about time we got back into this build, but first, we gotta backtrack a bit. Let's get into this. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Thanks so much for tuning in. Today, we're continuing with my Tamiya DT-03 Racing Fighter build series, where we will be getting into parts bag C. But before we actually do, we do need to sort of backtrack a little bit. There's been a few changes that I've made to the vehicle itself since the last video, and I'll leave a link to the last build video in the cards up above here. Now, again, warning, it's a long video, so if you're gonna sit through the whole thing, make sure you've got some snacks and maybe some drinks available, because it's well over an hour long. However, I should mention that I've actually added time marks to the last video and the video prior. So if you just want to jump to certain sections and not sit through an entire hour-long build, you can actually do that now with the last video, and I'll do the same with this video as well. However, before we actually get into parts bag C, we're going to talk about some of the changes that have been made to the DT-03 Racing Fighter since the last video. Now, some of the changes that I've had to make are sort of forced on me, while some of the other changes were actually suggestions from viewers who are following along and subscribe to the channel. So before we get into parts bag C, let's take a look at some of the changes that have recently been made to my Tamiya DT-03 Racing Fighter. So for those of you who've been following along with the build, you know that in my last video, I encountered a bit of an issue after installing the ball differential Tamiya hop-up option in the transmission of the DT-03 Racing Fighter. And the issue was that the drive cups that the ball differential came with were actually too small, so that I couldn't actually use the kit supplied dog bones that came with the DT-03. Now, in the video I had made mention that I wasn't too concerned about it because I had already ordered up another set of, or a replacement drive shafts for the rear of the DT-03. Well, they showed up, and unfortunately, they wouldn't work either. Now, the ones that I ordered up are right here. They're both from GPM. These are hardened steel, so they're very heavy duty replacement units for the stock units. And the issue is that the drive cups here won't fit in the ball differential. So as such, I can't actually even use the drive shafts that came from GPM. So I was forced to look for another solution. And the solution itself actually turned out to be a Tamiya hop-up option. That is to say, it's hop-up option 53791, which is a DF02 universal shaft set, which is now currently installed on the rear of my DT-03 right now. So that is the first sort of change that's happened since the last video. So I did install a set of those, which now alleviates the problem that I had with the drive shafts not fitting into these smaller drive cups of the ball differential. Continuing on with the changes that I've made, starting at the back here of the vehicle, you'll notice that I've actually installed aluminum alloy GPM rear knuckles. Now, in all honesty, I didn't really need to do this. This is more just an aesthetic thing. The factory kits that came with the DT-03 Racing Fighter are actually quite good. I haven't really heard anyone sort of complaining about these. I just did it because I figured, well, I was waiting for upgrade parts to show up anyway. I actually know that Tamiya makes a hop-up option that is an aluminum alloy. I personally just don't really like the anodized blue. I have nothing against it, that's just my personal feeling. So I know GPM made a black version, so I ended up ordering those up as well. So that's sort of the next upgrade that I had done, or the next change that I had done to the DT-03 since the last video. You'll also notice that I have installed spacers on the hinge pins that I used in the rear suspension, particularly the outboard end. Now, I actually went on eBay and purchased a number of precision spacers from One Racing. I actually got a set of 2 mil thick, 1 mil thick, and 1/2 mil thick as well. And I used a variety of these because this was something that I discovered during the build, where I was using these hinge pins as opposed to the screw pins that came with the kit. And unfortunately, in some instances, these hinge pins turned out to be a little bit too long for the application. So in this particular case, I've actually got a 2 mil thick washer or spacer out here and a 1 mil thick on the sort of forward side. Now, it doesn't really matter which side you put them on. I just did 2 mils on this side and 1 mil on this side, could go either way. I should also mention that I did also add 2 half mil thick spacers between the rear drive knuckle and the arms themselves, just to sort of take up some of that slop that you can sort of see in there. So that is essentially all the changes that have happened on the rear suspension of the DT-03 from the last video. Now let's make our way to the front. Now, one change that will actually be a little bit difficult to see is actually right through here. I replaced this sort of piece in here. I'll show you what the stock one looks like. I don't remember the number of this piece, but this is a piece that actually bolts basically the entire front suspension to the underside of the chassis. Now, this is the stock piece that came with the Racing Fighter itself, and I've replaced this with the GPM aluminum alloy piece, and it is a little bit difficult to see, but you can sort of see it right through there. Now, the main reason why I did this is because the original piece actually had a fair bit of suspension slop in it, and I noticed it after installing, buttoning up the entire front end. And I've got some footage showing sort of the movement in the front suspension. It was quite a bit, and I really wasn't all that happy with it. So in this particular case, I've actually installed the GPM unit, and it's actually taken a lot of that slop away. So I'm actually kind of happy that I've installed that piece. It's not something that anyone ever suggested or anything. It's just something that I wanted to do because I really wasn't pleased with the amount of slop that I was getting in that front sort of hinge area there. So I installed that, and it seems to have eliminated it. In addition, of course, I also did install a couple of spacers as well, the one-up racing spacers. If I'm not mistaken, I believe this is it's either a 1 mil or a half mil thick spacer, I don't recall, but I did install one back here in order to take up some of that slop. Moving to the outboard side, these were also sort of changed. I guess the C-hub right here, as well as the front axle piece, or the front upright. Now, the C-axle itself is actually a part that it was recommended to me that I consider upgrading to an alloy unit. Apparently, the factory pieces that come with the kit itself are a bit brittle, and apparently they do break relatively easy. Now, this was a suggestion by a viewer, and thank you very much for making the suggestion. I'm glad I've updated this because I really don't want to have to deal with that problem later on. So I upgraded this with another GPM alloy piece, and it's beautifully made, so this fit really, really well. And the front axle I've also replaced, put on a GPM part as well. Now, I will say this is really more just for looks. In all honesty, I think that the factory Tamiya part is actually very, very good. This is a nylon plastic piece. These things are very, very flexible. I don't know if you guys have tried to take off any turnbuckles from these things, but these things flex quite a bit, which just tells me that they'll take a heck of a lot of abuse before actually breaking. So this really wasn't all that necessary for me to replace. I just did it for aesthetics. So if you're following along with this build and you're trying to do your own sort of changes, I would actually recommend keeping the factory Tamiya part and not installing a GPM one, unless you just want it for looks. So that's the next change that actually happened. The other thing that I should mention, of course, is because I've gone with this GPM and they're all alloy pieces, the hinge pin that I was actually using, and again, if you refer back to, I guess the 2 videos prior of this build, I was actually using a hinge pin through this area here, and unfortunately, I couldn't reuse one of those hinge pins on the front suspension because of the way these are actually machined. You had to end up using the supplied screw that comes with the GPM part. Now, in all honesty, I actually don't mind it. The reason why I was using those hinge pins is because I wanted to get away from the screw pins that came with the kit from Tamiya. But this is actually a really high quality stainless steel fastener, so I actually don't mind this at all. So that basically brings you guys up to speed with respect to the changes that have happened to my DT-03 since the last build. So these are, like I said, in some cases were somewhat necessary changes that had to be made, and one, of course, was the suggestion from a viewer. And again, thank you very much for that suggestion. And a couple of these were really just more for bling rather than anything else. So now that we've run through all the changes that have been made since the last video and I brought you all up to speed, let's get into parts bag C, which for all intents and purposes, in this particular case, it is just the assembly of the CVA shocks. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna sort of clear out some of this stuff. I'll take everything out of the bag and we'll get ready and we'll get into parts bag C. All right, so now that we've emptied out all the contents of parts bag C into various containers, we're ready to get started. Now for the rest of this build video, we won't actually need the chassis itself, so we can actually move this out of the way. Additionally, we won't actually need the kit instructions either, because parts bag C, the CVA shocks themselves, actually come with their own set of instructions, which we'll be following. Now, if your particular DT-03 didn't come with a set of CVA shocks, then you will be following the instructions. But in this particular case, because we're building the CVA shocks, we'll follow these instructions instead of these. So we'll set this off to the side as well. Okay, and these are the actual instructions that we'll be following. This is just a single-sided sheet, 3 steps, relatively easy process. But before we get into this, let's actually take a look at some of the stuff that came out of parts bag C. First, we have the damper fluid itself. This is the Tamiya soft damper fluid. I believe this is a number 400 fluid. Tamiya does offer different viscosities that you can buy. In my particular case, I'm just going to stick with the soft for now. I may choose to change fluids in either the front or the rear shocks as time goes on, as I decide to sort of tune the vehicle. But for now, I'm just going to stick with the kit supplied damper oil. We also got the front and rear springs that were included in the bag as well. Standard issue steel springs, and a bag of steel shock shafts, oil, sort of O-rings, and some oil seals as well. And we got rear shock body parts. You'll notice these are in clear bags, because we also got the front shock parts that are in clear blue bags, which will kind of help differentiate between the two. And that was basically everything that came in parts bag C. So now let's get into actually building the CVA shocks themselves. First things first, because we're going to be dealing with some oil, it's a very, very good idea to put down some kind of a towel. I'm using a microfiber towel here to sort of contain any spillage that may happen during the assembly of these shocks. So we'll put that down. I'm also going to use some alcohol wipes as well. Alcohol wipes help to clean up oil really, really quick and easy. So just in case I need to clean something up, these things are probably going to turn out really handy. And I guess that's about it. So let's get started with step number 1. All right, so step number 1, take a look here, calls for lubricating and installing 2 O-rings into the bottom of each of the shock bodies themselves. Now, in this particular case, let's start with the rear shocks, and let's get some of these parts off of the sprues themselves before we start installing anything. So let me do that right now. So we've now cut the rear shock bodies off of their sprues. So you've got the shock bodies, the shock lower cap, and the shock upper cap as well. Now to start, I think I'm just going to build the rear shocks for now. The front shocks are built exactly the same way as the rears. Whatever you see me doing on the rears, I'm just going to duplicate for the fronts. So next thing I'm going to use, I have a small aluminum tray that I made. I don't mind getting oil into because this is just a throwaway item. So let's get out the long piston rods, which we'll need for the rear shocks. You'll notice there are shorter piston rods here for the front shocks. I'll show you the difference. So obviously these are meant for the front shocks and these are meant for the rear shocks. And good of Tamiya to actually even give us different colors so that we don't really screw this up. So we'll set this one aside for now. The long ones are the ones we're going to focus on for right now. In addition, we're also going to need O-rings. Let's get out these O-rings. All right, so we now have our shock shafts, and we have 4 of the O-ring seals that will go into the bottom of each of the shock bodies. So first step tells us to put oil onto the O-rings themselves. So let's do that right now. Good. So now the next step is to, we'll use our tweezers for this, insert 2 of each of the O-rings into the bottom of each shock body. Just like that. Hope you guys can see that. So I got 2 O-rings inside each of these 2 shock bodies. Push them down. Make sure they're properly seated. There, you can see that. They're properly seated now. And then we install a cap on the bottom. Now, don't install this all the way tight. Install it till it touches, then back it off about 1/4 to 1/2 a turn. This will just make it easier when you actually put the shock shaft through. So that's the one. Let me get on to the second one. Our shock bodies are now done and ready to accept the shock shaft itself. Now, according to the instructions, the shock shafts require a little bit of lubrication just on the ends, which will be important when inserting because they've got to make their way through those 2 O-rings that we just installed in each shock body. So let's get these pushed in all the way down, and there we are. So that's the first one installed, pulled all the way down. I'm going to get my trusty shock stand, just sort of set those in place, and we do the same for the second one. So that's what, let's take a look at these a little closer. That's what the 2 shocks should look like at this point. Now, it's also a very good idea to have paper towels available to wipe your hands as you're working, because this job does get a little bit messy. So, the next step is to actually install, I guess, the eyelet onto the end of each one of these shocks. So, let's get those eyelets off of these part sprues. All right, so we now have our eyelets and spacer off of the 2 sprues, and these have to be installed on the end of each of the shocks. So take one of our shocks, we install a little spacer. This is part number X3. It goes on the end here. And next we have to install part number X2, which is the eyelet that goes onto, threads onto the end of the shaft. Now, according to the instructions, this actually threads on fairly easy, but according to the instructions, you are supposed to hold the shaft with a set of pliers, needle nose pliers, and use a soft towel to keep from scratching the shaft itself while we tighten up that eyelet. So let's do that right now. So we can tighten this one up, and there we are. Good. Didn't really take that much effort, so that there is what the rear shock should look like after step 1. Let me get on to doing the second shock as well. Same as the first. All right, so that is now the second shock complete, second rear shock that is, complete as per step number 1. Now, as I said, the front shocks are actually the same as the rear shocks. They're put together exactly the same way. In fact, I'll tell you what, let's change plans and go ahead and actually assemble the rear shocks as well. So, or sorry, the front shocks as well. So let's do the same thing. So that there are the front shocks. You can see these are considerably smaller, although the top caps are the same. You can see that the front shocks are considerably shorter than the rears. So it's not that easy to screw this one up. So let's get into assembling the front shocks, which is exactly the same as the rears. We get our shock shafts ready, the shorter ones, of course, and the O-rings themselves, we'll put those in our little tray here because we got to lube those up. And we'll get those covered with oil. Good. Now they're nicely covered in oil. We repeat the process. So 2 O-rings on the bottom, the front shock bodies, push those in. That's what it looks like. And then we twist the cap on as before, and again, tighten it up till it touches, then back it off just a little bit. We'll tighten it up afterwards. So that's one shock body done. And the second one, do the same thing. And we're good. So 2 front shock bodies are now done and ready to accept the front shock piston rods. As per before, we add a little bit of oil to the end, which will make it easier to slip in. And then we just slide those on. Slide those in just like that. And out they come. Now, if you remember, we didn't tighten these shock caps up. Tighten them up now. Good. So that's that one done. Put that in our stand. We get on to the next one. And the second front shock is now done. Set the caps to the side. And now we add, in the case of the front shocks, we just need to add the eyelet. It doesn't actually get a spacer, so. All right, so we now have the eyelets cut off of our sprue. And just like with the rear shocks, same process. We thread these on. And then use a soft cloth wrapped around the shaft. Carefully hold them with needle nose pliers so we don't scratch, and just tighten them up. And that's it. Perfect. So that is one front shock ready for oil and finishing up. Let's do the second one. And that's that. That is the second one. So now both our front and rear shocks are now complete as for step one. On to step number two. Okay, so let's get on to step number two. Now, step number two is relatively easy. We're just going to fill each one of the shock bodies with oil, add an oil seal, and then cap them off. However, before we do, first thing I want to do is actually get back into the lower cap here and tighten them up. If you recall from the last step, I loosened these up just a little bit in order to make it easier for the shock shaft to be fitted through the two O-ring seals. Well, now that that's done, we can just tighten these back up. I'm going to do this now before I forget. Now, I've already done it for the front shock bodies, but I didn't do it for the rears, but now the rears are nice and tight. So that step is out of the way. So now we have to fill each one of these shock bodies with the damper oil. So let's do that now. All right, I don't know if you guys can see that on camera. Might be a little bit difficult, but there's the shock fluid all the way to the top. Now, according to the instructions, you're supposed to move the piston up and down slowly in the shock body to eliminate any of the air bubbles. So I'm going to do that over this little tray here just in case we lose any fluid. So I've moved the shock shaft up and down 2 times in this one rear shock, and now I'm going to let it sit in the stand for about a minute while I do the other shocks and allow any air bubbles to sort of naturally make their way out of the oil. So I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing with the rest of the shocks themselves. All right, so now that each of the shock bodies is now filled with oil and I've moved the piston up and down in each one to sort of eliminate the air bubbles that are in the oil, we're going to let them sit for about a minute. In the meantime, let's get our seals ready for the shocks themselves. So there's 4 seals, 2 different colors that we're given. The green seals go on the front shock bodies, so we'll set those aside for the time being. And the red seals go onto the rear shocks. So we'll set those aside as well. Now, according to the instructions, what is more than likely going to happen is once we put those seals on, oil itself will actually potentially make its way out of the shock and roll down the shock body itself. So the instructions say that you should wrap each shock with some kind of tissue paper or a cloth to eliminate any sort of spills. I've got a white cloth here that I'll use for this particular case. So I think the bodies have rested long enough. Let's start with the first rear shock. Wrap cloth around. Good. And we'll take the red oil seal, which goes on top. Press it down, and yep, we can see, I don't know if you guys can see it on camera there, but yes, there's definitely some oil making its way out, which is fine. That's exactly what I want to see, because that means that there's plenty of oil in the shock body itself. So I'm just going to wipe a bit of the oil off. And then we take the shock cap and install it. So the rear shock, well, one rear shock, is now complete. Now, here's the test. If I push in and let it go and it doesn't rebound, which it doesn't look like it is, that means there's no excess air in the shock itself. or in the damper itself. And that's exactly what you want. If you press in on the shock shaft itself or the damper shaft itself and it bounces out or it slowly rebounds out, it means that you do have air in the shock itself and you need to re-bleed or take the cap off, put more fluid back in, move the shaft up and down again to make sure that you don't have any air in the system. So this one is good. I'm going to call this one good. Let's get on to doing the rest. All right, so the 2 rear shocks are now complete. Let's get on to doing the 2 front shocks. Same as the rears, only difference, we're now using the green oil seal instead of the red oil seal for the front shock. So here we go. Okay, so that's the first of the front shocks. Let's test it out to see if it... Oh, we can see some rebound. That means that there's probably still air in this shock. So I'm gonna have to get back into this one and see if I can't bleed some of the air out and maybe add a bit more oil. But for now, I'm gonna leave it. I'll get back into it off camera after this build video is filmed. So this one, I'm gonna have to revisit. Let's get on to the next one. Much better. So this one here has very, very little rebound. I'm actually okay with that amount of rebound on this particular shock. So this one is good. I'm gonna have to get into the other one to figure out why it's rebounding the way it is, but I'll do that afterwards. So that brings us to the end of step 2. On to step number 3. All right, so on to step number 3. Now for step number 3, what we need are the spring perches themselves, which the springs will sit on at the bottom of each shock, as well as the springs themselves and these adjustable spacers, which help to sort of set that spring tension, which is more of a tuning thing than anything else. But those are the parts we're going to need. Now, the spring perches themselves are here on the sprues. These are ones for the front. So we'll cut those off those sprues right now. And the ones for the rears. Now the spacers themselves, or the CVA shocks, come with 3 different size spacers. I'm gonna cut all 3 of these off, but like I said, this is more of a tuning thing. So it's one of these deals where you'll put probably the thickest one on to begin with, and then as you sort of run the car and kind of get used to it and you want to sort of adjust the rear spring rate or the front spring rate by a small amount, you would add or maybe even subtract spacers as you see fit. So I'm going to cut these spacers off of these sprues here and set them aside. But like I said, for the most part, I think I'm just going to use the one thick one when I do assemble these shocks and then kind of adjust as I run the vehicle. So let's get that off here now. All right, and we do the same for the rear shocks. All right, so now that we've got our spring perches and spring tension adjustment rings cut off their sprues, the next thing we're going to need are the springs themselves. Now, if you recall earlier, I did say that parts bag C came with springs, and these are those that came with the kit. However, as has been the entire theme of this build, I won't be using these, and instead I have opted for Tamiya hop-up part. This is a DT-02 spring set, which will also work for the DT-03. This is hop-up option 53832. This set includes a set of soft springs. These are the ones that are in red for both the front and the rear shocks, as well as hard springs, the ones that are in blue for the front and the rear shocks. Now, the reason why I've gone with this, and again, based on sort of the research that I've done prior to getting into this entire build, is that because the motor on the DT-03 is sort of rear mounted, it is quite heavy in the rear, and many people who have a lot of experience with the DT-03 itself have said that a very good thing to do is to go with a harder set of springs for the rear shocks, which is my intention. So I'm going to actually be going with the harder rear springs on the rear shocks, and I'll be using the soft front springs. And the big reason why is because the engine is in the rear. For a layout like this, these cars tend to actually have a bit of understeer. So I'm going to run the softer springs in an effort to sort of give the front a little bit more grip. So soft springs for the front and hard springs for the rear. But again, these are tuning things. This is something that I can change as I run the car and figure out kind of what it likes and what it doesn't. So let's open this thing up and get these springs ready to go. So now that we have all of our parts out and ready, let's finish the assembly of each of the shocks. We'll start with the rear. So first things first, take our rear shock. I'm going to add, as I said before, sort of the thick spacer. For now, we could go with more or additional spacers if I want, but for the time being, I'm just going to stick with the one thick spacer at the top. We'll add the stiff or the hard blue spring on the rear. And then we take one of our spring perches and we push up on the spring a bit. And I believe that's that. Nope, sorry, I'm wrong. Done this wrong. The spacer that we installed earlier, this spacer here, needs to be pushed up. Spring goes in, and then the perch goes over the shaft, and our spring sits on it just like that. So that is the first spring, or the first rear shock completely assembled. I'll get on to do the rest of them the same way. So let's do that right now. So that's the rear shocks. Now complete. Let's do the front shocks. And there we have the first front shock is now fully assembled with the softer red springs up front. And there we are. So now both front shocks or dampers are now completely assembled. So that's step 3 of the assembly instructions, and that brings us to the end of this build video. If you found any of this useful or even mildly entertaining, please consider liking this video, and certainly if you want to follow along with the rest of this build, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. I'll catch you guys in the next one. See ya. Hey guys, just before I let you go, I wanted to let you know that I made a mistake when installing the spring perch in the build video, I actually installed this upside down where there's a flat side to this piece, and it should have been facing the spring. Instead, it was actually facing the eyelet. So I've already gone through, I realized the mistake after filming the video, so I've already gone through and corrected this on all the shocks. But just make sure if you're following along and building your own that you install this piece with the flat side facing the spring and the sort of bell-shaped end facing the eyelet. So sorry about that mistake. Good thing I caught it. Just wanted to let you guys know about it. Thanks again for watching, guys. We'll catch you in the next one.